Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we say hello to Numan Ali. Hey, Numan, how are you doing?
Hi, Eric. I'm good. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Thanks for joining. So, today we'll talk about how to build an API style guide. And you're
Mm,
working at Stoplight, and Stoplight has created Spectral. And I think Stoplight is doing a lot of work right now in this idea of
mm.
how to design APIs, of course. And today we'll just focus on how to build an API style guide. But before we do that, let's briefly discuss why we're even doing that. So, if you had to explain to somebody, why would I even do this? Why do we build API style guides, Numan?
Yes. All right. So yeah, I'm primarily looking at the API governance piece in Stoplight, and that terms is thrown around a lot in terms of what does API governance include, and it certainly includes a lot of stuff, like your process around reviews, and other standardization. But what I would be primarily looking at is style guides as being a very effective tool. And why is that? We have seen a lot of companies put out their style guides in PDF forms, like you'd see PayPal, Google, with these like 90 page long style guides, but this still work in the sense that you at least have some sense, or your people who are designing APIs have some sense on what good looks like in your company. So if a person comes in new and starts designing APIs, they're not going completely astray. So I think style guides really help building those parameters around what good API design looks like in your company.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like you say, and I think it's really um, clear from what we've seen from the published style guides, like those companies who have large API
Mm-hmm.
landscapes, they have invested first into the style guides because
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a scaling issue, right? The more people you have creating APIs, the more APIs you have, the more you want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that those people get some guidance. You can maybe build some tooling around it, and
Mm-hmm.
we'll look into how you can do that in a scalable way today. And I think that's really
Yeah.
kind of the main thing here, right? The scalability. So if we jump
Yep.
into now, what should go into those?
Uh,
What
uh,
what's
just,
your
just,
approach?
just before getting to that, I think you have a really good point around scalability and this becoming a problem apparent at scale. But I think even for smaller companies, starting with what good looks like, there's no real standard. So I think starting early with the style guide really helps, but it certainly becomes more apparent at scale for sure.
Yes, and there is, like, as you will show, right? I think there also is the possibility to say, well, look, we're not investing a lot into building a style guide because maybe we can just reuse the one
Mm-hmm.
from Google or whatever, right, for a little while
Mm-hmm.
and see how that works for us. But at least we'll have one. So if people have
Yes.
questions around designing APIs, right, they don't have to ask over and over again. At least we'll have something to
Mm-hmm.
base that on. And that's actually what I tell most companies when they ask me how to build a style guide. I always tell them, well, start with something that you like and then
Mm-hmm.
start tweaking it over time.
Yes, for sure, for sure. All right. So you were asking about like what should a style guide contain, and I think starting with we're talking about those PDFs. I think the first bit, and a lot of people that are watching this would have seen there are automated tools that can do these style guide bits now. You can create rules that can really be run maybe within your environment and within the CI, like Spectral or OpenAPI CLI out there. And the idea is, I think how I see it, there are two different buckets that these rules can go into. There
Okay.
are two different goals that you might have. One is you're using Open API, hopefully you are, and that powers a lot of your tooling down the road, which is you're generating clients or generating documentation, and you want that Open API to be of good quality. It's easy to say, but harder to do because it's a difficult syntax. There's a lot of nitty gritties. So you really want to make sure that the Open API is good, and then there's this other bucket, which is, all right, what does good API design in my company look like? Like, what casing do I use, or how do I do pagination in my company? What security schemes do I use? So I think style guides generally become these two buckets of rules that you bring together and to achieve these two goals: good open API and actually building good API design, which really results in a better developer experience, the combination.
That's, I think, a useful way to
Mm-hmm.
separate things a little bit, right? By
Mm-hmm.
saying we need some discipline, how we
Mm-hmm.
practice, so to speak, with APIs. And then we also need some discipline on which APIs we're even building.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at Spectral, it
Mm-hmm.
comes with a whole bunch of built-in rules, which you
Mm-hmm.
can just use, right? That's another thing that I always tell people: if you want to use Spectral, just use it and just
Mm-hmm.
benefit from the built-in rules. You don't even have to define your own. what are these built-in rules doing if you look at these two buckets you were just describing?
All right. So the built-in rules are primarily focused on the open API part of things. And there's also an async API rule set, so the async API part of things, primarily focusing on making better API designs, or sorry, open APIs. And the idea is with these rules, add a tag, add servers, please. Make a valid open API, so don't put in the wrong syntax. So if you're using basic Spectral and you're sure just because valid open API is a good artifact out of your effort anyways, so you start with those. I think starting with those bucket of rules is a good way to go get started with things. But you can add on to those open API guidelines. Like always having examples or always having descriptions is a good idea because you want good documentation generated out of your open API, right? Like even smaller companies, the first thing that you do out of an open API is generate docs. And if you have those examples, those descriptions, and some sort of a style guide around it, you'd be creating much better open API. You can also go ahead and start doing things like Open API for its history has multiple ways of doing things, right? Path parameters can be put into on the operation level or on the path level. It's always a better idea to put them on the path level because they're path parameters. So you can create a rule around it just to make sure that you're following the right or the best practices when it comes to creating open APIs. So I think there's an array of rules that you can create just to make sure that your description that you're putting out for your other tooling is really high quality. There's also one other bucket that you can potentially use once you're at this phase where you have good practices around open API. You could also go ahead and make sure the tooling that you're using downstream, you're following the right standards there. So let's say you're using a gateway that requires your open API to have particular properties or doesn't support particular properties. An example is I think Amazon Gateway doesn't support any of. So if you're using Amazon, you'd want to make sure that your style guide has this rule saying don't use any of, otherwise your gateway isn't going to work well. Or maybe you're using a client generator that doesn't support the discriminator property, so you can make sure you don't allow people to write those. I think this is just that next step, because at the end of the day, the open API is being used for tooling, just to make sure that your tooling is also, the open API that you're generating conforms with the tooling that you're using.
I think that's a really interesting idea of, that the governance is not just the governance for the API, but the governance also for all the tooling around, and you want to make that effective. Just out of curiosity, because you have spent quite a bit looking into the space, how much tooling have you seen that actually comes with Spectral rules, right? Where you could imagine that a tooling manufacturer or somebody who creates tools will actually give you Spectral rule sets and say, look, if you use my tool, then maybe this rule set would be a good thing to use so that my tool works better. Have you seen that a lot?
I think not as much as I'd like, for sure. Certainly, I think it's more a community-driven effort right now. I've seen an Amazon Gateway rule set out there on GitHub, which is just people who are using Amazon, but it's more a community-driven thing than Amazon coming itself and saying this is a Spectral rule set if you're using the gateway. There are other style guides that so Italian government comes up with their own just to make sure their API is fine. So there are community-driven efforts certainly there, but I think as Spectral grows and as our awareness grows around what we can do with it, I think there certainly needs to be a more effort around the industry just to make sure we're building these out.
Yeah, that may, if we have this conversation 2 years from now, there actually may be quite a number of rule sets out there, right, that the manufacturers themselves produce. We'll see.
Yes.
Okay, now this is all the tooling or all, let's say, the rules that make sense to control Open API itself. And then there's this other bucket. So how would you kind of approach that bucket?
All right, and I think this is where Spectral and like the work that it does gets much more interesting, which is building what good API design looks like in your company. And there are no right ways of doing APIs. Like there are multiple ways, even across these large companies that do APIs well. There's just so many ways of how do you version things, what security scheme should you use. There's just so much divergence. So I think having these bucket of rules, and then it might not be perfect, but at least you have one way of doing things across your company, is building out these rules around API design itself. And how I think you could particularly approach it as there are standards out there that you might start with, like say JSON API. You're starting your program. You really like how JSON API does defines things. Doing APIs, you could start with a JSON API rule set, which is a list of rules just how you do JSON API, but it doesn't cover everything, right? It's not covering the security piece. So you might go and say, OWASP API top 10 is a really good set of 10 rules that you go and combine them. So you combine these standards, and then you obviously have your own flavor, your own industry. You might be in a particular industry, like say the health industry or the airlines industry that has particular standards across their own, across the industry itself. Start with these company as industry or industry specific standards or standards itself, but then put your own flavor on top of it. There's always going to be a debate between, I think, 10 designers within your company saying what casing should we use for our paths. Have that debate, but once you have that debate, put that into a rule. I want my paths to be kebab case or camel case or whatever your preferred way is, but like really create some rules around casing, security schemes, pagination. Again, multiple ways of doing it. Just choose one and put a rule around that. And there are like the smaller things to do, like always have a 201 when you're creating a post. Like this is a good one to have, but then not everybody does it. So might probably a good one to have. Don't have the errors property within your success responses. If it's an error property, it should go in an error response. So there are basic things too that putting into a style guide really helps, especially a new person coming in and you're a 500-person company. How would they know what good looks like? Is this through these set of standards that you built for your company? So I think start with the standards that you already have, put your own flavor, and you can really come up with a good set that really works for you, I believe.
I like the way, how you kind of build it up in terms of, well, first you can use something that's out there. So mostly you just pick those and then you use them. And then over time you add your own things to it, maybe because you realize that, maybe we should have a rule around this, right? But it's an incremental effort. And I think that's really what kind of matters most here. It's not something you do once and then that's how it should stay. It's really you start small and then you build it up over time.
And once you're done with all these rules and you're really like confident about building style guides, then get to the versioning rule, because that is probably going to be a big conversation and probably a fight in your company. So you can get to that the last one at the last. I think
probably not the first one. Yes,
probably not the first one for sure. All right.
Okay, so now we've looked at what to do, so how to build those style guide in terms of the different types, and then also kind of the strategy, how you develop it over time. Now I think you've prepared a little demo to show us, and I think we can just dive right in here and see how this all looks in practice, because in the end, right, the more easily you can manage all of this, the more you're likely to do it, and also to do it over time, which I think also is an important part here.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like you said, it's building style guides is great, but also making sure they're easy to follow by people who need to use them. They don't need to read 80-page documents, and rather getting the errors in the right place at the right time is important. So what I have here is just like, I talked about two different buckets: open API rules and API guidelines. So this is my bucket of open API. What I've done here is use the default Spectral rules that we talked about, the bucket that it comes with, like just valid open API stuff, put in your contact name, put in your info descriptions, put in API server. So this is just the basic set that Spectral comes with. So use that. That's always a good start. But then you can always do stuff like, this is just one example, but we talked about other few, which is like always including examples. What I'm doing here is just saying every schema that I define in my open API should have those examples described, so that the tooling can get those examples, put them in the right place, maybe the client, maybe the documentation generator. So I think this is one bucket, which is the open API style guide. You could start with Spectral, add your own rules, and build this out. The other bucket that we were talking about was the API style guides. And like we talked, we could get started with some standards. So what I've done is I got started with OWASP top 10, just those top 10 rules of security that you should really follow. Like, don't use HTTP basic, put some rate limiting headers into your API. Then enforcing HTTPS, again, a basic one. Just start with the basics. Like you can have, you need to always have HTTPS defined on your servers. But then I also went ahead and added a few rules to my style guides, like say path casing. I want my paths to always be kebab case. So these are more in that bucket of what does good API design look like for me in my particular case. You could create a rule like what does your server look like? Do you want API.domain.com or domain.com/API? These are things that you can decide on in a style guide and really put those rules. Now, once you have these rules or style guides created, these are Spectral files, an open source tool that you can just go ahead and start putting in your design environment. So if it's Stoplight Studio, they'd appear there. If it's VS Code, they'd appear in the right place, like you'd use ESLint. So you can use these style guides that you've built in different places wherever you're designing Open API. The example I have here is I'm building an open API here, and what you see is errors that I'm not putting the right responses. I'm doing a lot of things wrong. So I have 16 errors, 18 warnings. The idea is that while designers are building these or designing these APIs out, they should get these. So they're catching them early and fixing them early. If these are found in an API design review environment, you've wasted all that time and effort that people have put in to create these APIs. So I think really bringing them into the design environment is important in real time. And the final bit, which is a tricky topic, is enforcement. Do you enforce these rules? Maybe you don't get stuff.
You cannot say enforcement. That's a bad word to use.
Okay.
So you have to encourage people to follow them, or But enforcement is a tricky word.
Yes. So I don't think not enforcing them, but encouraging them. The first step to encouraging is bringing those errors into the design environment. But then you can also go ahead and put them into your CI, which is, let's say I have I have the GitHub workflow set up for my designs, and as a pull request is created for this design, the designer gets some errors and warnings right in the CI as a CI check. So you can really go ahead and make this part of your reviews. Let's say you're doing your reviews in your GitHub environment. You can get these errors, make sure that these are out of the way before getting into the actual fun bit. What does this API do? Does it fulfill the business requirements? Not focused on these basic things like what casing should we follow? Now that is being managed by your style guide. So I think same theme, make it easy for governance to happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had a little while ago, I had this discussion with Ikana and Waiwu, and he said exactly what you were just saying. It's like, I want my API design reviews to discuss the interesting parts and not all the things that I can automate. So automation here is really the goal. And what I think is really nice, as you showed it, because it's based on a machine readable format that is understood by multiple tools. You can even have people designing their APIs in different tools, and they will all follow the same guidelines, because it's this language that you can use across tools. And I think that's really one of the big values that Spectral brings here, because Spectral kind of morphed into being this industry standard for these rules, and that makes it easier to share those rules, I think.
Yep, exactly. I think the first big achievement for this for us as an industry was bringing Open API as a standard. So we have machine readable stuff for API design, and I think now with the Spectral stuff, it's like machine readable stuff for your API governance. So we're really moving towards automation in these different phases, which I think is really exciting for the industry as a whole.
Okay. So I think we have a pretty good story here, right? So for API governance, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you can scale things nicely. And I think the way that guidelines are an idea to do that, and then the way that we've now looked at with using Spectral rules and in this modular way, I think that turns it into a practice that you can actually put into your organization. Numan, thank you so much for joining us. I was just wondering, so what would be the next thing to discuss? So I think this was a pretty good one, but So if we would go one step further, what would be the next thing to discuss? You know, if we thought about this as a real serious.
Yes, I think we talked about the buckets, but really, what do those buckets contain in detail? Because I think one of the biggest questions we get is what rules to build, and I think if we can really get into the details of what these rules are and what these rules could be, I think that would be a very interesting one for us to discuss.
Okay, so you showed some examples already. I think those
Mhm.
kind of gave a little bit of a tasting menu
Mhm.
of that. But yes, I agree. Let's have a next video where we talk about in more detail what kind of things actually should go into the guidelines. But I think for today we actually had a pretty nice presentation of how to do it in the first place.
Yes, for sure. This is fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks again for joining, and thanks everybody for watching. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and until next time, keep getting APIs to work. Bye, everybody.
Bye.